The snow was falling harder than I had expected. The forecast had warned of a storm, but I hadn't thought it would hit this soon. By the time I reached the cabin, the wind was howling, and the trees swayed like they were alive, bending under the weight of the icy gusts. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. Just me, some books, and a chance to escape the chaos of the city. But as I stepped inside and slammed the door shut behind me, shaking snow off my coat, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up. "Are you kidding me?" I muttered under my breath. No one was supposed to be here. This was my sanctuary, my retreat. The cabin belonged to my husband's family, and while I knew it wasn't technically mine alone, I had been assured I'd have the place to myself. I peeked out the frosted window and saw a familiar figure stepping out of the car. It was Nathan, my husband's son from his first marriage. He was bundled in a thick coat, his dark hair barely visible under a beanie. I sighed, opening the door before he could knock. "What are you doing here?" I asked, not bothering to hide my irritation. "Nice to see you too, Claire," Nathan said with a smirk, brushing snow off his shoulders as he stepped inside. "Dad said you'd be here. Thought I'd swing by and check on the place before the storm got worse." "You couldn't have done that next weekend?" I shot back, closing the door behind him. The cabin was small, and his presence immediately made the space feel cramped. "I was kind of hoping for some alone time." "Well, sorry to ruin your plans," he said, his tone light but his eyes scanning the room. "But it looks like you're stuck with me for now. The roads are already bad, and I'm not about to drive back in this." I wanted to argue, to tell him to leave, but one glance outside told me he was right. The snow was coming down in thick sheets, and the wind was relentless. Even if I didn't want him here, I couldn't send him back out into that. "Fine," I said, crossing my arms. "But don't expect me to entertain you." Nathan laughed, pulling off his coat and hanging it on the rack by the door. "Don't worry, Claire. I'm perfectly capable of entertaining myself." I rolled my eyes and turned away, heading toward the small kitchen area. The cabin wasn't much, just a single open space with a kitchenette, a couch, and a fireplace. There was a loft upstairs with a bed, but that was about it. It was cozy, sure, but not exactly designed for two people who didn't particularly like each other. Nathan and I had never been close. He was 25, only 10 years younger than me, and had always made it clear he didn't approve of my marriage to his father. He thought I was too young, that I didn't belong in their family, and while I tried to brush off his comments, his presence always put me on edge. As I busied myself making tea, I could feel his eyes on me. "So, what were you planning to do up here all by yourself?" he asked, leaning against the counter. "Read, relax, enjoy the quiet," I said pointedly. "Well, you've still got 2 out of 3, he said with a grin. I ignored him, pouring hot water into a mug and wrapping my hands around it. The warmth was a welcome contrast to the chill that seemed to seep through the cabin's old walls. Nathan, meanwhile, made himself comfortable on the couch, kicking off his boots and stretching out like he owned the place. "Do you have to take up the whole couch?" I asked, glaring at him. "Relax, Claire. There's plenty of room," he said, patting the cushion beside him. "Come on, sit down. You look like you could use a break." I hesitated, then sighed and sat on the far end of the couch, as far from him as possible. For a while, we sat in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the wind howling outside. Despite my annoyance, I had to admit the storm was worse than I'd thought. The snow was piling up fast, and the cabin felt more isolated than ever. "You know," Nathan said suddenly, breaking the silence, "this isn't so bad." "What isn't?" I asked, not bothering to hide my skepticism. "Being stuck here is kind of nice, actually. No emails, no phone calls. Just peace." I glanced at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. For a moment, he didn't seem like the sarcastic, judgmental stepson I'd always known. He looked relaxed, almost vulnerable. "Yeah, well, let's see how you feel after a few hours of this," I said, taking a sip of my tea. He laughed, and the sound was warm, almost infectious. Fair enough. But hey, if we're going to be stuck here together, we might as well make the best of it. I didn't respond, but a part of me knew he was right. The storm wasn't going to let up anytime soon, and whether I liked it or not, we were in this together. As the evening wore on, the temperature dropped even further. The cabin's old heater struggled to keep up, and I found myself pulling a blanket around my shoulders. Nathan, noticing my discomfort, got up and added more wood to the fire. "Thanks," I said softly, surprised by the gesture. "Don't mention it," he said, sitting back down. "So, tell me something, Claire. Why did you really come up here? Don't tell me it was just to read." I hesitated, not sure how to answer. The truth was, I had come here to escape. My marriage to David, Nathan's father, had been strained lately, and I needed space to think. But I wasn't about to share that with Nathan. "I just needed a break," I said finally. "From my dad?" he asked, his tone probing. "From everything?" I said firmly, cutting off the conversation. Nathan raised his hands in mock surrender. All right, I'll drop it." We fell into silence again, but this time it felt less tense. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room, and for the first time that evening I felt myself starting to relax. Maybe, just maybe, this weekend wouldn't be as bad as I'd thought. By the time I woke up the next morning, the storm had only gotten worse. The windows were frosted over, and the wind howled like a wild animal circling the cabin. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and glanced toward the couch. Nathan was already awake, sitting cross-legged with a cup of coffee in his hands, staring out the window. "Morning," I said groggily, sitting up. He turned to me and gave a small smile. "Morning. Looks like we're not going anywhere today." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Great. Just what I wanted. An extended vacation with you." Nathan chuckled. "Don't sound too excited. I'm great company." I rolled my eyes but didn't bother arguing. Instead, I made my way to the kitchenette, grabbing a mug and pouring myself some coffee. The silence between us felt heavier than it had last night. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was the fact that there was no escaping each other now. We were trapped. "You know," Nathan said after a while, breaking the quiet, "I don't think I've ever seen a storm this bad. It's kind of beautiful in a way." I glanced out the window. The snow was falling in thick, swirling sheets, blanketing everything in white. It was beautiful, I had to admit, but also suffocating. Beautiful, sure, but it's also a death trap. If something happens, we're completely cut off. Nathan shrugged. "That's half the fun, isn't it? No distractions, no responsibilities. Just this." I didn't respond, focusing instead on the coffee warming my hands. Nathan had a way of making even the most frustrating situations sound like an adventure. It was irritating, but also oddly comforting. "So," he said, leaning back against the couch, "what's the plan for today? Board games? Deep philosophical discussions? Or are we just going to sit here and glare at each other?" I snorted. "Do you even know how to play a board game that doesn't involve cheating?" "Wow, Claire, that's harsh," he said, feigning offense. "I'll have you know I'm an excellent board game player. Honest and fair." "Sure you are," I muttered, but a small smile tugged at my lips despite myself. Nathan grinned, clearly pleased with himself. "All right, how about this? Let's make a deal. We'll play a game, and if I win, you have to answer one question, truthfully." "And if I win?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Then I'll answer one of yours," he said, holding out his hand. "Deal?" I hesitated, then shook his hand. "Deal. But don't think I'm going easy on you." "Wouldn't dream of it," he said with a wink. We ended up playing a card game I found in one of the cabin's drawers. It was old and missing a few pieces, but it worked well enough. To my surprise, Nathan was actually pretty good. He played with a mix of strategy and charm, throwing in jokes and comments that made it hard to focus. I hated how easily he could get under my skin. "All right," he said after winning the third round in a row, leaning back with a smug grin. Looks like I win. Time to pay up. I groaned, setting my cards down. Fine. What's your question? He tilted his head, studying me for a moment before asking, Why did you marry my dad? The question caught me off guard. I stared at him, unsure how to respond. That's personal. That's the point, he said, his tone softening. You promised to answer truthfully. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I married David because he made me feel safe. After everything I'd been through, he was steady, reliable. I thought that was what I needed. Nathan didn't say anything at first, just nodded slowly. And now? What do you mean, and now? I asked, narrowing my eyes. Do you still feel that way? He asked, his voice quiet but probing. I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. Did I? Lately, things with David had felt off, distant, but I wasn't about to admit that to Nathan. It's complicated, I said finally. He nodded again, as if he understood more than I wanted him to. Fair enough. Your turn. I was tempted to ask him something equally personal, to turn the tables on him, but instead, I said, Why do you hate me so much? Nathan blinked, clearly not expecting the question. I don't hate you. Could have fooled me? I said, crossing my arms. You've been cold to me since the day we met. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. It's not about you, Claire. It's about everything. My dad, the divorce, the way things changed so fast. You were just part of all that. I frowned, his words sinking in. It wasn't the answer I'd expected, but it made sense in a way. So, you don't hate me? No, he said with a small smile. You're all right. Annoying, but all right. Thanks, I said dryly, but a part of me felt lighter. Maybe this weekend wouldn't be so bad after all. The rest of the day passed in a strange sort of truce. We played more games, made lunch together, and even managed to laugh a little. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the tension between us began to thaw. It wasn't exactly comfortable, but it was easier. That evening, as we sat by the fire, Nathan turned to me and said, You know, I think this is the most we've ever talked. Probably, I admitted, staring into the flames. It's nice, I guess. Don't sound too enthusiastic, he teased, nudging me with his elbow. I rolled my eyes but couldn't help smiling. For the first time, I felt like we might actually get through this weekend without killing each other. Maybe even come out of it a little closer. But as the fire crackled and the snow continued to fall outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between us. Something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The storm showed no signs of letting up by the next morning. The cabin felt smaller with each passing hour, the walls closing in as the snow piled higher outside. I stood by the window, staring out at the endless white, trying to ignore the growing tension in the air. Nathan was sitting at the table behind me, absently flipping through an old magazine he'd found in one of the drawers. Still nothing? He asked, glancing up. Still nothing? I replied, my breath fogging up the glass. We're completely buried. Even if it stopped now, it'd take days to dig out. Nathan leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms over his head. Guess we're stuck with each other a little longer. I turned to look at him, his casual demeanor grating on my nerves. You seem awfully okay with this. Why wouldn't I be? No work, no responsibilities, no distractions. Just us and the storm. He smirked, the corner of his mouth twitching upward in that infuriating way of his. It's almost romantic, don't you think? I rolled my eyes. You're impossible. And you're uptight. He shot back, but there was no malice in his voice. If anything, he sounded amused. Seriously, Claire, when's the last time you just let go? Stopped worrying about everything and just lived in the moment? I didn't answer. The truth was, I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt truly free. My life with David had been comfortable, yes, but also predictable. Safe, maybe too safe. But that wasn't something I was about to admit to Nathan. Instead, I changed the subject. What do you usually do during storms like this? He shrugged. Depends. Sometimes I read, sometimes I write. Mostly, I just enjoy the quiet. You write? I asked, surprised. Don't look so shocked, he said, laughing. I'm not completely useless, you know. I didn't say you were useless, I muttered, though the thought had crossed my mind more than once. Nathan stood up, crossing the room to stand beside me at the window. He was close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off him, a stark contrast to the cold seeping through the glass. What about you? He asked. What do you do when you're not playing the perfect wife? The question caught me off guard. I don't know, I said after a moment. Work mostly. Read when I have the time. Nothing exciting. Sounds lonely, he said softly. I bristled at his tone, at the way his words seemed to cut deeper than I wanted them to. It's not lonely. It's just life. Nathan didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe me. I turned away, suddenly needing space. I'm going to make some tea, I said, heading for the kitchen. Claire, he called after me, but I didn't stop. I needed a moment to collect myself, to push down the strange mix of emotions bubbling to the surface. As I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, I could feel his eyes on me. It was as if he could see right through me, past the walls I'd built and into the parts of myself I tried to keep hidden. It was unsettling, and yet, I couldn't bring myself to tell him to stop. Do you ever think about leaving? He asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. I froze, my hand hovering over the tea canister. What? David, he said, leaning against the counter. Do you ever think about leaving him? That's none of your business, I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. Nathan held up his hands in mock surrender. All right, touchy subject. Forget I asked. I turned away, focusing on the tea instead of the knot tightening in my chest. The truth was I had thought about it, more than once, but admitting that to Nathan felt like crossing a line I wasn't ready to approach. The kettle whistled, breaking the tension. I poured the water into 2 mugs, handing one to Nathan without a word. He took it, his fingers brushing mine for a brief moment. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I quickly pulled my hand away, retreating to the couch. Nathan followed, sitting down on the opposite end. For a while, neither of us spoke, the only sound the wind howling outside. The silence was heavy, but not entirely uncomfortable. It was as if we were both waiting for the other to say something, to break the fragile truce we'd built. Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? He asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at him, startled by the vulnerability in his tone. What do you mean? He stared into his mug, his expression unreadable. I don't know. Like you're following a script someone else wrote for you. Doing what's expected, not what you really want. I hesitated, the weight of his words settling over me. Sometimes, I admitted. But isn't that just life? We all make compromises. Maybe, he said, his gaze meeting mine. But what if you didn't have to? What if you could just start over? I didn't know how to answer that. The idea was tempting but also terrifying. Starting over meant letting go of everything I'd built, everything I thought I wanted. It meant admitting that maybe, just maybe, I'd made the wrong choices. Nathan must have sensed my hesitation because he smiled, the tension in his face easing. Sorry. Didn't mean to get so heavy. Must be the storm. It's fine, I said, though my voice sounded distant even to me. I don't know. For a while, we sat in silence, the fire casting flickering shadows across the room. I could feel the weight of Nathan's presence beside me, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. It was as if the storm had created a bubble around us, a space where time didn't exist and the outside world couldn't reach. And in that bubble I felt something shift, something I couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore, either. Nathan broke the silence first, his voice low and hesitant. Claire, can I ask you something? I turned to him, my heart pounding for reasons I didn't fully understand. What? Do you ever wonder what it would be like if things were different? His eyes searched mine, the question lingering between us like a challenge. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself staring at him, caught in the intensity of his gaze. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, and for a moment, it was as if the storm outside had moved inside, swirling around us in a chaotic, unrelenting force. "I don't know," I whispered finally, my voice barely audible. Nathan didn't look away, his expression unreadable. "Maybe you should." The words hung in the air, unanswered, as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside. And for the first time since the storm began, I felt truly trapped, not by the snow, but by the questions I wasn't ready to face. The next morning, I woke to an eerie silence. The wind had stopped, and for a brief, disorienting moment, I thought the storm was over. But when I looked out the window, I realized the world was still buried under a thick, suffocating blanket of snow. The quiet wasn't a reprieve. It was the kind of stillness that presses down on you, heavy and unrelenting. Nathan was already up, sitting by the fire with a mug of coffee in his hands. He didn't look at me as I walked into the room, but I could feel the tension radiating off him. It was a stark contrast to the easy banter we'd shared the day before, and I found myself hesitating, unsure of what to say. "Morning," I offered finally, my voice awkward and tentative. "Morning," he replied, his tone distant. I frowned, pouring myself a cup of coffee and sitting down across from him. "You okay?" He shrugged, staring into the flames. "Fine." It was a lie and we both knew it, but I didn't push. Instead, I sipped my coffee in silence, the weight of the unspoken words between us growing heavier with each passing second. Finally, Nathan broke the silence. "I had a weird dream last night." "Oh?" I said, trying to sound casual. "What about?" He hesitated, his fingers tightening around his mug. "I don't know. It's hard to explain. I was somewhere else, somewhere warm. The sun was shining, and there was this feeling, like everything was exactly how it was supposed to be." I tilted my head, studying him. "That doesn't sound weird. It sounds nice." Nathan laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah, well, it didn't last. I woke up and here we are, back to reality." Something about the way he said it made my chest tighten. "Nathan, don't," he said sharply, cutting me off. "Don't try to make it better. It is what it is." I stared at him, unsure of what to say. This was a side of Nathan I hadn't seen before, raw and vulnerable in a way that made me both uncomfortable and strangely drawn to him. It was like seeing the cracks in a carefully constructed facade, and I couldn't look away. "Sometimes I feel like I'm suffocating," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like no matter what I do, I'll never be enough. For my dad, for anyone." His words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he was enough, but the truth was, I didn't know if I believed it. Nathan had always seemed so confident, so sure of himself. Hearing him admit to these doubts felt like stepping into uncharted territory. "You don't have to be enough for anyone else," I said finally, my voice soft. "You just have to be enough for yourself." He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. "What about you? Are you enough for yourself, Claire?" The question caught me off guard, and I felt my cheeks flush. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've spent so much time trying to be what other people want me to be. I'm not sure I even know who I am anymore." Nathan nodded, as if he understood. "It's exhausting, isn't it? Pretending all the time." "Yeah," I said, my voice barely audible. "It is." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the room. I could feel the weight of Nathan's gaze on me, and I forced myself to look up, meeting his eyes. There was something there, something unspoken but undeniable. It made my heart race in a way I didn't fully understand. "I think you're stronger than you realize," he said finally, his voice steady and sure. I blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. "What?" "You heard me," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're stronger than you think. You just don't see it yet." I didn't know how to respond. No one had ever said something like that to me before, and the words felt like a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. I wanted to believe him, but a part of me was still clinging to the doubts and fears that had defined me for so long. "Thanks," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Nathan nodded, his smile fading as he turned back to the fire. The moment passed, but the weight of his words lingered, settling in my chest like a seed waiting to take root. The rest of the day passed in a strange sort of haze. We talked more, about everything and nothing, the conversation flowing easily despite the tension that still lingered beneath the surface. It was as if the storm outside had forced us to confront not just each other, but ourselves. And in that confrontation, something had shifted. That evening, as we sat by the fire again, Nathan turned to me with a mischievous glint in his eye. "All right, Claire. Truth or dare?" I laughed, the sound surprising even me. "What are we, teenagers?" "Come on," he said, grinning. "Humor me. Truth or dare?" I rolled my eyes but couldn't help smiling. "Fine. Truth." Nathan leaned back, his grin widening. "All right. If you could do anything right now, no consequences, no regrets, what would it be?" The question caught me off guard, and I felt my smile falter. I don't know." "Come on," he said, his tone teasing but his eyes serious. "There's got to be something." I hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on me. Finally, I said, "I think I'd leave, just walk away from everything and start over." Nathan's expression softened, and he nodded. "Yeah, I get that. What about you?" I asked, desperate to shift the focus away from myself. "What would you do?" He didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the fire. Finally, he said, "I think I'd stop running, face the things I've been avoiding." The honesty in his voice took me by surprise, and I found myself staring at him, searching for something I couldn't quite name. Nathan had always been a mystery to me, a puzzle I couldn't solve. But in that moment, I felt like I was starting to see the pieces come together. "Your turn," he said, turning to me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Truth or dare?" "Dare," I said, surprising even myself. Nathan's grin returned, and for a moment, he looked like the carefree, confident man I'd always known. "I dare you to be honest with yourself. Just for tonight." I opened my mouth to protest, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I nodded, the weight of his dare settling over me like a challenge I wasn't sure I was ready to face. As the fire burned low and the night stretched on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, something I couldn't stop, even if I wanted to. That night I couldn't sleep. Nathan had fallen asleep on the couch near the fireplace, but I stayed awake, staring at the dying embers, the last flickers of light dancing on the ceiling. His words kept replaying in my mind. Asterisk, "I dare you to be honest with yourself. Just for tonight." Asterisk, honest with myself. What did that even mean? For as long as I could remember, I'd been living a life that felt like it wasn't entirely mine. Every choice, every decision seemed to revolve around what was expected of me, what David wanted, what my family thought was right, what society deemed acceptable. I'd never stopped to ask myself what I wanted. Maybe because deep down I was afraid of the answer.
I glänst over at nighten.
His face was peaceful in sleep. The sharp edges of his usual smirk softened in the dim light. For all his teasing and bravado, there was something about him that felt real, like he wasn't afraid to face the messy, complicated parts of life that I'd spent years trying to avoid. And somehow, being around him made me want to do the same. The storm outside had finally calmed, the howling wind replaced by an almost deafening silence. I stood up, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders, and walked to the window. The world outside was still buried in snow, but the sky was clear now, the moon casting a soft, silvery glow over the landscape. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost surreal, like the kind of beauty you only notice when everything else is stripped away. "Can't sleep." Nathan's voice startled me, low and rough with sleep. I turned to see him sitting up on the couch, rubbing a hand through his messy hair. "Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you," I said softly. "You didn't," he replied, standing and stretching before walking over to join me by the window. "What's on your mind?" I hesitated, the weight of his earlier dare pressing down on me. "Just thinking about." I looked at him, his face illuminated by the moonlight. There was no judgment in his eyes, just quiet curiosity. And in that moment, I realized I didn't want to keep hiding. Not from him and not from myself. "About my life," I admitted. "About how I've spent so much time trying to be what everyone else wants me to be that I don't even know who I am anymore." Nathan didn't say anything, but the way he looked at me, steady and unwavering, made it easier to keep going. "I thought I was happy with David," I continued, my voice barely above a whisper. "But now I'm not so sure. I don't know if I ever really was, or if I just convinced myself that I should be." Nathan's gaze didn't waver. "What do you want, Claire? Not what David wants or your family or anyone else. Just you." The question hung in the air between us, heavy and unrelenting. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. Because the truth was I didn't know. Or maybe I did, but I was too scared to say it out loud. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice cracking. "I don't know what I want." Nathan reached out, gently taking my hand in his. His touch was warm, grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. "That's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to have all the answers right now, but you deserve to figure it out, and you deserve to be happy." Tears prickled at the corners of my eyes, and I quickly looked away, embarrassed. But Nathan didn't let go of my hand. He just stood there with me, silent and steady, as the weight of everything I'd been holding in slowly began to lift. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. The next morning, the sun rose on a world transformed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine, untouched landscape. The snow glistened like diamonds in the sunlight, and the air was crisp and cold, carrying the promise of a new beginning. Nathan and I worked together to dig out the cabin's front door, the physical labor a welcome distraction from the emotions still swirling inside me. By the time we finished, the path to the main road was clear enough for us to leave. The thought of going back to my old life filled me with a strange mix of relief and dread. As we loaded our things into Nathan's truck, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "So, what happens now?" I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think I need to figure that out on my own." Nathan nodded, his eyes searching mine. "You're stronger than you think, Claire. Don't forget that." I smiled, the sincerity in his voice touching something deep inside me. "Thank you for everything." He grinned, that familiar spark returning to his eyes. "Anytime. Just don't wait for another snowstorm to figure out what you want. Okay?" I laughed, the sound light and genuine. "I'll try not to." As we drove away from the cabin, the world stretched out before us, vast and open and full of possibility. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't just going through the motions. I didn't have all the answers, but I had something better. The courage to start asking the right questions. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.